how we're going to navigate these worlds. And really, at the end of the day, just as we saw in 2017, this is really, all action is local, as we know, all politics is local, all action is local. And so how are we going to build this local capacity? How are we going to use this moment? And how are we going to get through this very uncertain and kind of scary time in the interim to get to a more robust action past this moment? So with that, I'm going to have panelists introduce themselves. I'm going to start with Joel from the state of Washington, who I'm so glad that the state of Washington can come and join us today. Considering that they're one of the bright spots in U.S. climate policy right now. And so I'm going to start with maybe just going down the line, having everybody introduce themselves, a little bit about their backstory, do it, maybe 2-3 sentences, and then we'll circle back and then kind of have Joel do his kind of opening remarks and framing.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Russ. So I'm Joel Creswell. I'm the Climate Pollution Reduction Program Manager at the Washington Department of Ecology, which is a real mouthful, but I oversee our market-based climate policies, so the Clean Fuel Standard, the Cap and Invest program, and then also several others, our Zero Emission Vehicles program, greenhouse gas inventory, hydrofluorocarbons. And and my background is actually an environmental scientist by training. I have a PhD in environmental chemistry and used to tinker around in analytical labs, and then wanted to have a bigger impact on problems I cared about. So I did a hard pivot into policy, went out to DC, worked at the EPA and on Capitol Hill, and then came back to Washington State where they were taking real action on climate change. So here I am.
My name is Mike Wallace. I'm the Chief Decarbonization Officer at Persefoni. We're a carbon accounting and management software solution that's automating the way businesses and any stakeholder can measure their carbon footprint. I've been in the environmental field for about 30 years, most of it in California, and bumped into various laws over the course of my career and have navigated through those as a consultant, but also worked in the nonprofit space for organizations like Business for Social Responsibility, ICLEI, and the Global Reporting Initiative. I think what's really fascinating about today's conversation and where we are is this subnational opportunities that are out there, but also just the multiplier effect of those of us that work in this field and the associations, the networks that we work with. How do we really democratize carbon accounting? I'm at the front end of this pipeline that is this conference. It's like we might think people have good numbers, but actually not everybody has numbers, and not everyone is ready for verification or compliance. And we'll get into some of the weeds on that.
Hi all, I'm Sarah Eisant. I'm the Deputy Secretary for Climate Policy at the California Environmental Protection Agency. So in that capacity, I work really closely with the California Air Resources Board, but also with the other boards, departments, and offices that are under the agency, which includes our Department of Recycling, CalRecycle, our Department of Toxic Substances Control, the state water boards, for example. So there's a lot of climate work that actually happens across all of those other boards, departments, and offices, in addition to the Air Resources Board. And I have experience at the federal level working for Senator Feinstein, and then also most recently before joining Cal EPA, I was with the City and County of San Francisco in the mayor's office working on environmental policy and also on state and federal affairs. And I'm looking forward to today's discussion.
Hello, did that work? Yes. My name is Emily Wimberger. I'm managing partner at Nani Partners. We are a consulting firm really focused on subnational climate and clean energy implementation. I'm also a recovering bureaucrat. I spent a long time at the California Air Resources Board working on the cap and trade program, and then as chief economist. And we were sort of joking, Mary Nichols was here yesterday, and once you work for Mary, you always work for Mary. It's a little funny. But really my area of expertise is sort of California climate policy, regulatory and legislative affairs. And we also do a bunch of work at my firm really focused on how to think about the federal to state to local pipeline, which has gotten a little convoluted, especially in the funding space recently. So we'll get into that a little bit. But lots of uncertainty and lots of opportunity. So excited for this panel today.
Yeah, I want to build off of what Emily just said and the fact that I would say that we are probably not the only panel at this conference where more than 50% of the panel worked for Mary Nichols at one point in time. So, we have 60%. We have me, Sarah, and Emily. And, before the end of the conference, Mike and Joel might work for Mary. But it's possible. We're not over yet.
I might be working for her now, and I don't even know it.
Yeah, exactly. So I want to frame this up by going to Joel first. The state of Washington, we all know about the outcome of 2117. Joel also mentioned the Clean Fuels Program. I think because I'm going to have him and Sarah talk first about the state of states, state of subnationals, how we're going to move forward, how things are going to continue to progress. And where they're thinking the next 3, 6, 9 months are going to go, and how we're going to have to be flexible in how we talk about things, the narrative of what we talk about things, and also some of those lessons learned from Washington that I think we all saw really did work about how we talk about the benefits of climate policy. Go for it.
Yeah, thanks, Ross. So, we had a real, apart from that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the show moment in November where, the federal election didn't go in a good direction for climate policy. And I say, I'm totally apolitical here, right? But we have been changing direction on a lot of priorities that are important to Washington State, and yet in Washington State, we had a really strong popular vote in support of climate policy. What do I mean by that? If you weren't tracking closely our Climate Commitment Act, which is the statute that governs our Cap and Invest program, was on the ballot. There was an initiative to repeal it, and that initiative failed by an overwhelming margin of 62%. And interestingly, it even failed in a number of counties that voted for Trump. And so that just goes to show you that climate action, and especially, I think, and this is me just sort of making my own judgments about the narratives that were in play during the campaign, but people were really motivated by what the revenue from the Cap and Invest auction supports. I mean, I think people care about pollution, air pollution, climate pollution, but there was also a lot of focus during the campaign on the fact that it was funding electric school buses so kids aren't exposed to diesel exhaust. It was funding safe routes to school. It was funding things like heat pumps for low-income people, which improves comfort and health and lowers energy bills and pollution. It was funding our state's $110 million grant program for transitioning from diesel to zero-emission heavy-duty trucks. And so when confronted with taking all of those things away, people said, no thanks. Whatever the cost might be, and I don't think people really have a good sense of what the costs are to them when they go to the grocery store or fill up the tank, in spite of what the people who want to take down the program might say, people felt like the costs were worth it. And so I think that's a really important message for other states at this time. I used to work under Governor Jay Inslee. He called us not subnational governments, but supranational governments, because he thinks that we're going to save the world, and I agree. And I think a lot of states have started to look more closely at programs like a clean fuel standard, which doesn't generate revenue for the state, but does put revenue into low carbon transportation fuel in a way that doesn't impact state budgets. And then Cap and Invest programs, which does generate revenue for the state. And we all know that legislators have a list of priorities they want to fund that's infinitely longer than the amount of funding available, right? And so at a time, especially when federal funding is diminishing, I think this provides a really good option for states to fund priorities. And of course, all of this is totally separate from the fact that these programs also put a cap on emissions and ratchet that down over time, which is also something that we all know we need to do. But I think that honestly, the appeal of making progress on priorities like decarbonizing transportation with funding and on investing in projects that fight climate change, those are real strong motivators for a lot of states. And so our message to the other states out there is come on in. The water's fine. And in Washington, part of our mission, and this is part of California's mission as well, is to really help facilitate other states coming on board. And so as we were coming on board into the Cap and Invest space, into the LCFS space, California CARB staff gave us a lot of support, a lot of technical assistance, gave us no-cost licenses to software that they had developed. I mean, there's a lot of information sharing that's incredibly valuable. And we think what we did was took all of that support from California, which has been really helpful, and plotted a course to bringing on these major climate policies that, frankly, we didn't have the resources to develop ourselves from the ground up. but we showed how a state with modest resources can do it. And so we think that, we set a good example for other states that are, significantly smaller than California, which is most states, to follow. So I think that's our picture of what climate action at the state level should look like for the next 3 years and 10 months.
Yeah, thanks so much, Joel. I mean, so from taking what Joel just talked about, right, and talk about how those resources were developed, right, and much of that was done in Sacramento by the folks at the California Air Resources Board, by Emily and her colleagues, over starting in 2006 with the passage of AB 32, and then running through that wall, time and time again, over much of the last decade, to get things like fuels under the cap and navigate our own ballot initiative, right? We a lot of times we forget that California already defeated a ballot initiative too, and then the state did stand up and say how popular climate action is as well, and so Sarah, let's go to you next, because a lot of folks in my world said, well, where's the governor? Where's the governor? In January and February, and even into early part of this month, and my response was, he's responding to climate change. We were dealing with the historic wildfires. That was the priority. The priority was to make sure that people got into housing, that their needs were met. It was an all hands on deck approach. I know that the folks at Cal EPA basically lived down here in Southern California for months, and so I said he's responding to it. And then last week we got to see the next step in the iteration. So talk about what the announcement last week and where you all are going with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Ross. So the announcement that Ross is speaking about is that Governor Newsom announced that he will serve as co-chair of America is All In, which is a coalition that was created during the first Trump administration to show the commitment of states, but also of NGOs, educational institutions, faith-based coalitions, sort of a broad swath of American economy and institutions that people are still committed to meeting the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. And I think that this announcement that was recently made really speaks to a long history of California stepping up to continue to show subnational leadership on climate action. And it's one coalition of many, really, that we are a part of and helping to lead on the subnational level. So I wanted to speak a little bit just, to reiterate maybe some of the points that you might have heard from Chair Randolph's keynote yesterday, and also from Rajinder Sahoda's plenary with Mary Nichols, about just really our California commitment on climate. And just to share, I think many of you might know this, but between 2000 and 2022, greenhouse gas emissions in California fell by 20%, while our gross domestic product increased by 78%. So really pointing to the effectiveness of our climate change and air quality programs, while still being able to support our economy and to benefit Californians. And really, we are continuing that push on climate action. Californians overwhelmingly support climate action to protect public health and the planet. And as we do that locally, and as we advance our work within California, we are also continuing to identify opportunities to scale that impact and to work with other states and jurisdictions, as Joel was speaking about, that we really, as the, sort of a first mover in a lot of climate policies, have learned a lot over many years, and that there's an opportunity to share the knowledge that California has acquired with other states, and that's with other states in the US and with other states internationally. So just really briefly, we are a founding member of the Pacific Coast Collaborative. This has been in existence since 2008. This is a group of California, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. We meet regularly. It's staff from governor's offices that are coordinated on sort of a wide range of climate-related policies, from clean transportation, zero-emission vehicles, to low-carbon fuel programs. We are also a founding member and of the U.S. Climate Alliance, which was created in 2017, also during the first Trump administration, also in response to the pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement, showing that U.S. states would continue to remain at the table continue to do their part to deliver the U.S. commitment to the Paris Climate Agreement. And it's now up to 26 states in the U.S. So just those 26 states represent 55% of the U.S. population and 60% of the U.S. economy. And so to me, that gives me a lot of hope that we have these coalitions that are not slowing down, that we are really continuing on the work. And sort of as to what Chair Randolph and Deputy Executive Officer Sahota spoke to yesterday, we are heads down doing the work. We know what we need to do to address climate change, and we're going to keep doing that. And then I want to just share briefly that we also do a lot of work on the international space. That's a big part of my job at Cal EPA, is coordinating our international partnerships. We are a founding member also of the Under 2 Coalition, which was created in the lead up to the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015. So we're celebrating 10 years of the Under 2 Coalition now, and that's hundreds of governments that are part of that coalition. And it's an opportunity for us, again, to sort of share our best practices in California and to learn from others. And then just in closing, we have 20, I think, maybe a little bit more than that now, of agreements, memorandums of understanding with other subnational governments and with other countries. So you might know, but California, we have, I think, 6 new memorandums of understanding that were signed with the Chinese federal government and Chinese subnationals, all about advancing our climate work and doing so to share solutions that we know work and scaling that impact globally. So, and then Governor Newsom also just recently signed an MOU with the Mexican state of Sonora. And that is to strengthen climate and economic ties between the states, including through work on clean energy and resilient supply chains and collaborating on clean transportation fuels. And then he also recently signed another MOU with a consortium of 21 Brazilian governors. So this is, part of in the run-up to COP around sort of bolstering those subnational partnerships and the supranational importance, really, of what we can do, because this is where a lot of the climate action is happening. It's at the states and it's at the local level. And, California is committed to this work and will continue to be over the coming years.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sarah. So I know that we can only take in so much in our brain, so I'm going to focus on 3 big topics, right? And I'm going to follow up with Sarah on one, which is methane. I want her to dive a little bit deeper on the subnational methane action and how you all are thinking about how to maybe backstop some of the change in administration. We saw tremendous efforts from the Biden administration to release, the EPA released Subpart W to reduce methane from the oil and gas sector. There was loans given out of the Department of Energy to reduce methane emissions and do better monitoring and sensors. A lot of this is built on the foundation, the framework of the good work of the California Air Resources Board, the California Oil and Gas Rule called COGR, that really set these kind of high bar standards for the oil production, because we're largely only oil producing in the state of California. We import most of our gas. And so I've been wondering what you all are thinking about doing on that methane topic, which is so important, but doesn't necessarily always get the sexy headlines.
Sure. So thanks for the opportunity to speak about our work on methane. I think maybe going off of the work on international, one of the things that California has done is launched the Subnational Methane Action Coalition. So I think we're up to now 20 governments. These are subnational governments that are committed to reducing their methane emissions. And this was launched 2 COPs ago, and is sort of a subnational counterpart to the Global Methane Pledge. And again, that pledge really emphasizes the importance of slashing our methane emissions, as it is a short-lived climate pollutant. And we know that if we want to slow the impacts of climate change, that being able to address methane emissions will help in the short run. I think there is a lot that California is doing in the methane space. As Chair Randolph also spoke about, last year the Air Resources Board updated the oil and gas methane regulation and is planning on taking up the updates to the landfill methane regulation this year. And so there will be some activity in that space. And then one of the other things I would like to highlight, which was also an announcement last week, is the launch of a methane satellite and methane satellite data acquisition that the California Air Resources Board is leading. So this really is a first-in-the-nation effort to track and reduce methane emissions. And this was made possible through cap-and-trade auction proceeds, through funding from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Program that enabled the state to enter into a contract to purchase satellite data detecting where there are methane emissions happening, and then to be able to use that data to then go out and enforce and stop those leaks. And so that's something that a lot of other jurisdictions are really interested in learning from California's experience as that gets underway. Certainly, we want to work with other jurisdictions who want to access similar data to understand where in their jurisdictions there are methane leaks so that we can not only know that that's happening, but again, make it actionable and enforceable to really do something to stem those emissions from happening. So can talk more about that, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, that was really just a moderator's prerogative to talk about the cool satellites and, the fact that, here in California, promises made when Governor Brown stood on a stage and said, we're going to launch our own damn satellite, and we did. Emily, I want to go to you next and talk about how your, Hunani Partners, so much of what they've done over the last few years is help local governments get ready for all of the Biden era spending opportunities that really impacted local governments, local capacity building. It's like just filling this incredible need and incredible, there was always great community groups doing this, but they didn't always have the technical resources. They didn't bring state level leaders, that kind of stuff. And I really appreciated what their organization was always trying to do, is connect those dots between federal, state, and local, and how do we deploy the dollars. Talk about an uncertain time right now for all those dollars. Where are you all at? Where are you all thinking about going as we take this next step?
Yeah, thank you. It's strange days. I think was it Donald Rumsfeld that said there's known knowns, there's unknown unknowns, and so we're sort of in that phase. And I think Rajinder mentioned this yesterday, but there's a lot of uncertainty, but there is sort of long-term goals that we need to sort of aim for. And there's a lot of swirl, there's a lot of churn, everything feels like it's in a blender, everyone's hair is on fire, what is happening? But it's also a moment to take a pause and say, hey, what are the institutions that are in place? What are the partnerships that have been established? How do we think about relying on the resources that were there in Trump 1.0, and how do we adapt those to a very different playing field? I'm an economist by training. I now currently just play one on TV, but sort of my issue, even back in the day, was I think people sort of have carbon fatigue. Like, it's really greenhouse gas emissions that are sort of esoteric. Everyone knows about polar bears, we want to save them, but what really matters to humans is what they see in their day-to-day lives. And so as an economist, it's really easy to talk about the cost on a gas pump for a cost per gallon from carbon emission, from a carbon program, but there's all these other costs that we're absorbing. I mean, we're in LA right now, we see the wildfires. There's all these costs of climate change that are here that we just take for granted. And so for me, I think this is a time to really shift, and we've seen this in some of our partnerships in helping state and local jurisdictions try to figure out how to move forward in this space. It's maybe let's focus on what the benefits are. The IRA and Rhodium Group put out a great report on this earlier this year. Repealing the IRA will increase energy costs. The majority of IRA funds are committed to places that are in Republican districts. This is not just climate-aligned states that this is helping, this is all Americans. How do we really focus on those messages, get those messages out there, highlight wins that we've seen in terms of investments that are made, jobs, transitions to clean energy and what that's doing for communities, community benefits and health benefits, really taking sort of oh, and by the way, we're also helping to save the planet. I think that's sort of the paradigm shift we need to think about. So a lot of the work that we're doing right now in this churn is really trying to provide states support. Federal funding has been, it's stop, start. There's been changes in the guidelines. There's been changes in timelines. There's been freezes and unfreezes. It depends on who you ask by the minute. So a lot of the work that we're doing now is trying to provide that surge support to really help states who don't have capacity, and this was sort of the impetus of the state funding readiness program, was states don't have, there's a lot of money coming out, but they don't have the internal capacity to deal with it. It's sort of like tax exists for a reason. Like, you can do your taxes, but you want sort of a program to help you with that. So that's really the work that we provide. And right now it's really focused on really near short-term surge capacity and trying to help states shore up the funding that has gone out the door and making sure that it's implemented in ways that not only benefit the climate, but have sort of comprehensive benefits for communities. So yeah, it's an interesting space. It changes by the minute, but we're here for the long haul. And I think that's sort of the message of California and Washington. Like, there's durability. People, like the majority of humans have sort of shown support for these programs in different ways. And it's like, how do we think about the messaging now that we're in a different space? It's not Trump 1.0. It's a very different landscape that we're living in right now.
Well, perfect segue to going to Mike next. When we talk about taxonomy, the rhetoric we use, the language we use, no one has been more in the line of fire than the ESG movement, right? I mean, literally, you've got the word, the ESG has become sometimes a crime to talk about, depending on which state you're in, it feels like. And so, Mike, and with Persefoni, you all are the TurboTax for carbon accounting. You all are trying to provide a quick and easy way for a company to bring you on and understand their data, understand their scope. How are you all thinking about navigating this moment with such a different federal landscape when it's maybe not about carbon as much as it is about understanding your supply chains or understanding your national security risks or other things? How are you all thinking about how to change the narrative but execute the same goals?
From a software solution point of view, this is actually a good thing, because the more confusion out there, the more people need support, right? And a solution, right? Think of the IRS tax code and why we can use TurboTax, right? You want to make it easy. You also want to move this from spreadsheets. I'm a recovering consultant. I've done spreadsheets for most of my career. I knew is once I gave you that spreadsheet, you wouldn't keep it up. You wouldn't keep the emissions factors and the calculations up. And you probably would send it around to a bunch of friends in the company, and someone would inevitably mess up the math. And then you'd call me up in a panic because you wanted to report to CDP next year, and you're like, I need some help. I'm like, well, you came to me at the 11th hour. It's going to be expensive for me to throw a bunch of resources at you to do the math. So why would you not want this to live in the cloud? And that's what our founders came up with while they were at Chesapeake Energy. They don't come from our background, right? But they were dealing with investor questions from Wall Street, and those investors were saying, look, we want to invest in you, Chesapeake Energy, but we want to know that you can do these things. And our current CEO was the Chief Information Officer. Now, where does carbon information live? In the Chief Information Officer's offices, in the Environment, Health, and Safety offices, maybe the sustainability offices, also in finance, and certainly in procurement. And we'll get to that procurement scope 3 piece in a second. A couple of cliches. You can't manage what you don't measure. Old and dated statement, but it's very, very true. Think of any time you go to the doctor and the typical things they do to measure how you're doing. It leads to other things, decisions that you make. The other one is everyone is someone's scope 3. So this played out in real time in the last 3.5 years I've been at Persefoni, where we have a couple of former SEC attorneys on our team, one of which wrote the climate rule for the SEC. Now imagine you wrote that 500-page document, how personally you take this. And she had a counterpart, Emily Pierce, who was running around the world dealing with all the standards bodies. I could throw a bunch of acronyms at you, but I won't. And regulatory authorities like the SEC saying, what are you guys doing? We don't want to create a climate rule in the US that's really completely out there, but we want to align. So Emily and Christina take this job very seriously. They're on our team to keep tabs on all this regulatory developments around the world, but also subnationally. And in all that work, I had multiple phone calls with US corporations who were like, well, why don't we talk to the general counsel, our lawyers in-house, and talk about what this really means. We'd bring Emily and Christina in to talk about where the SEC might go. They were no longer at the SEC. And inevitably, the general counsels, no offense to older white men like myself, but mostly older white men don't really believe in these things. Like, we're just going to wait. I think the chamber is going to sue the SEC, and we might not have to do anything. Totally fine. In the meantime, the UK government puts out an RFP, a request for proposal, through the National Health Service, right? It's the hospital system for the country. And that RFP lands in a bunch of inboxes to US medical service and equipment providers. some of the same people that said, we'll just wait and see what the chamber's going to do. RFPs, those of you that have ever received an RFP, have a due date. And they ask for price, delivery time, quality, references. And by the way, this one, since it came from a nation, it had this beautiful little box that just said, fill in your scope 1, 2, and 3, explain how you got the number and whether you had it verified. Now, if I'm competing with these 5 people on a bid, and it's a $10 million bid, you're better beware that I'm going to dot every I and cross every T, and I'm going to race to get those numbers in there because I don't want to lose that contract. That was a real example that played out in real time in the last year. Now, I tell you that story because it relates to some of the stuff here. Healthcare is a very unique space in our country. It makes up about 20% of the GDP. And if the NHS can do that and have that ripple occur across the world, right, across the world, why can't the likes of Kaiser Permanente or Common Spirit or other healthcare institutions do this? Well, they actually are. Our hospitals in this country have grouped together in some very big coalitions. Go back to the association and coalition field. Think about what's in a hospital. They buy a lot of stuff, right? From food services to computers to cleaning products to the biopharma space. If we can just flip a little switch in the way that we procure things in this world, it's going to force a lot of the non-disclosing companies in the world to step up and do it. Now, I'm all for regulation. I believe in regulation and all that, but we witnessed it ourselves, how it can just be derailed in an instant, right? Procurement policy is the future of this field, honestly. And every one of you are in a buyer position in your organizations, whether you know it or not, or realize it or not. And in 20 years of working in sustainability, truly in sustainability, very few times did I ever talk to procurement. But procurement's now at the table, thinking about these things. And we can go into SB 755 whenever you're ready.
Let's do it. So, yeah, so, this year, the good folks that helped pass Senate Bill 253, 261, you just heard at the plenary, now sometimes referred to as 219, the Climate Reporting Disclosure Act, and also the climate risk bills. That's being implemented by the Air Board. We heard about the fact that there's an RFI out. We got questions. There's public comment. The Air Resources Board continues to implement. They continue to hire. They're moving forward. So that's a great subnational story that's out there in light of the federal headwinds. But also that same coalition has now introduced a bill with Senator Blakespear all around procurement. So Mike, take it away. Talk about what you all are doing on the procurement angle.
Well, it's not so much what we're doing with Blakespear in California so much as what's happening in the market. Once you start to measure these things, you understand your scope 1 and 2. It's pretty easy to do that. But you get to scope 3, 15 categories. We're not going to go down a rat hole with all that. But the big one is purchased goods and services, category 1. And for a state, it's also category 15, finance emissions, right? What CalPERS and CalSTRS does with maybe some of your investment money is a big part of our scope 3 as a state. So if the state's going to commit to these different things, how does the state walk the talk when it comes to procurement? The state buys a lot of things. It's a very large state. Buy a lot of things, and when you look at the list of suppliers, which is accessible through Department of General Services, you can see certain studies that DGS has done over time to look at its own carbon footprint based on the sectors where it buys things, right? But you can also get down to the specific company level, public and private companies that supply the state of California with goods and services. And as we rebuild the state after the fires we've been experiencing, how do we want to procure responsibly or with a view towards impact or carbon neutrality or decarbonization? We have that ability to do that. We have the ability to get the numbers. We have the ability to do what the UK did with that NHS RFP next year. States always go out to bid. So imagine that next bidding process when we're looking to buy for the state of California's own operations. Now, in that sphere, I've been doing a lot of due diligence in this space. There are other departments and agencies that do procurement. One glimmer of hope that I have, and many of you might be graduates of part of the UC system, the University of California buys a lot of stuff. 5 of the campuses have medical centers tied to them, so that healthcare connection. And if you're in healthcare, you have a duty to do no harm, and doctors and leaders of hospitals have connected climate change to health and well-being, and they need our help, right? And there's some of these large institutions are faith-based, so there's another angle to this where you do get different groups of constituents together, and they can really help us all make the case for responsible or decreased carbon intensity procurement decisions. So 755 right now as written, if you're a supplier doing business of more than 25 million per year, you need to pay attention to 253 and 261. So what's being done there is like, we're not going to just create something brand new. We're going to align some of this work. In Carbon Accountable, Michael Schmidt's right here in front of me, is being a big part of that work to align it. We don't want to create more confusion for everyone. So there is nice alignment in where we stand right now. Things will change, of course, before it gets implemented. But imagine that list of suppliers. It's out there for you and I to see, and I've got the list. I've been looking at it. How much contract dollars are spent per year with these suppliers, and kind of like CDP does, do you disclose and measure scope 1, 2, and 3? Can you tell me what methodology you used? Can you tell me if any of your numbers have been verified? That's coming, whether we like it or not or agree with it. But we can all get on in this boat and start rowing in that direction. And every state can do it. Every county can do it. The University of California can do it. There's no reason not to do it, honestly, if we really care about these things.
Can I piggyback?
Please, absolutely.
Yeah, so one thing I want to add about the importance of procurement policy is that it's actually, it also marries up really nicely with market-based emissions trading systems in that it helps prevent leakage. If you are a national or a multinational government like the EU, you can do border adjustment. And that's a way that you sort of, price in the competitiveness effects of your carbon policy. But as states, we can't do that. So California, Washington have no-cost emissions allowance allocation to large businesses that are trade exposed, and that's an anti-leakage policy. But the other way that you can help mitigate leakage is to essentially create a competitive advantage for those companies that are pricing in their emissions. Now, disclosure is not pricing it in, but that is the first step in that direction, and that helps everybody who's buying those products understand the value that's created by simply existing in a place where your carbon emissions are priced.
Yeah, Joel, I mean, I think that is the key point in a lot of this is how are all the links in the chain getting connected, right? And just as Joel said, right? The states and the subnationals can't necessarily do tariff policy. We're not allowed to do carbon border adjustments. We can't do this. We have to respond to what national actors do. But how can we connect data to procurement, to better program execution? And I think largely, what I'm hoping for is we'll learn all these lessons, these building blocks of, the shoulders of which we stand on, whether it's California, whether it's Washington, of AB 32, SB 32, and then the post-2030 efforts in the state's climate policy, whether it's California or Washington, will be based on better data, right? It's all about better data. That's kind of what was behind SB 253 and 261 a couple of years ago. Yes, it's about getting investors better data, getting more transparency, so our PERS and STIRs can make better investments for residents of the state of California, but it's also about how do we integrate better data. So it's not just our mandatory reporting program, their MRR program, which is a huge success, flies way under the radar for largely, but how can we expand it to not just the companies that have to submit MRR things? How do we get to what Mike has been talking about, that everybody is somebody's scope 3? We can we can get a better sense of the global supply chains and global carbon bombs that exist elsewhere that we don't necessarily get a lot of visibility to. The last of the big things we've talked about we've talked about climate disclosure and where that's going. We've talked about methane. We've talked about local capacity and state readiness and how that's going. I think the big last thing that I want to talk about is the politics and the narratives and all this kind of stuff. And so I know we're going to move to questions in just a minute or two, so start getting your questions ready for our panelists here. But really, I'm just going to go down the line and think about what is one or two things that's going on internally at their organizations that's of interest to talk about when it's talk about how are we positioning ourselves to deal with our core constituencies. It's just a little bit like Emily talked about. How do we continue to tell that story in a better way and still implement at full speed?
Yeah, thanks, Ross. I think there are a lot of things we can do. I talked about some of them before, but I think some of the ways that we are positioning ourselves a little bit differently now than we were a couple of years ago is that we are actually taking some steps California's taken in the past to not rely on federal tools, federal data, and in some ways also federal funding. I would say that's a process, right? Because in some cases the federal funding was shut off very quickly, and so we're still reacting to that. But the advantage of being a state that has revenue-generating climate change programs is that you can direct some of that revenue to creating at the state level some of the tools and data services that we used to rely on from the feds. So some concrete examples of that are EPA's greenhouse gas reporting program currently exists, but the electronic greenhouse gas reporting tool, EGRIT, was shut off for a number of weeks, almost 2 months earlier this year, and it wasn't clear if it was going to come back on. It did come back on. We don't know how long that'll last, right? EJ Screen, which a lot of state governments rely on for funding decision-making. There are some technical, in some cases statutory requirements. That's totally gone. And so there are other things, the state greenhouse gas inventory tools. So in Washington, we are building our own versions of those tools and data sets using state-level data, and that will just make us more resilient, such that if the federal policy winds change again in the future, we can continue to be consistent in our policy direction.
Yeah, Mike, what's next in Persefoni for trying to continue to move forward on this procurement angle? Take the NHS model question. Take it. Where's the next 60 to 90 days for you all?
I think the big thing is capacity building and maybe even collaborations with some of the people on the panel about that. There's a lot of need for education out there. So projects that we do, and particularly that I lead with professional associations, include the National Association of Corporate Directors, the Society for Corporate Governance Professionals, National Investor Relations Institute, Financial Executives International, and probably the one I'm most proud of recently, we've created a partnership with AICPA. So if you're a real nerd, that's the Association for International Certified Public Accountants. The CPAs of this world realize the future for their industry is in carbon accounting. Their association, a global association of 400,000 members, I'm not saying all 400,000 are coming to my courses, but we're putting on courses where those CPAs are getting a continuing education credit for attending 1 hour of carbon accounting training. Why are we not rolling that out? Now, the biggest chapters of all of these groups I mentioned to you, these are US-focused groups, but every developed country has similar organizations. The biggest chapters of all these groups I mentioned, where are they? California. It was the California branch of the AICPA that said to AICPA International, hey, not only California, but Washington and Oregon and other blue states are going to want to ramp up their carbon accounting capabilities given the results of the election. So we're on a road tour, basically, to do more education like that and looking for friends and partners. Part of the founders' vision was to create a free Persefoni Academy. So there's courses that can be taken and run on a website, and to create a free carbon accounting software. So anybody out there, just like TurboTax, when you get out of college, you could use TurboTax for free, because wisely, TurboTax realized you'd probably buy a house and have some kids and an investment, you might want the premium version. So freemium is a common thing in software. So any of you have no excuse to not know your scope 1, 2, and 3 in all 15 categories, right? You're gonna walk the talk here, you need to know your footprint. And that same free version is built on the same product that multinational corporations are using to report into regulated schemes. So you're getting some quality emissions factors, these calculations, right, that are up to date and ready for compliance and for verification. So we want to give this stuff away as fast as we can to democratize carbon accounting. And the free version also goes to that old rhetoric about, what about small, medium enterprises? We're a small, medium enterprise, right? We do our own carbon footprinting. We should. We're selling these services, so why would we not, right? So the small, medium enterprise thing, that's a line of BS that I can work through it with any audience you want to put me in front of. But we have community colleges around this state that have committed at the community college level. The president, right, has said, we are on this carbon accounting journey. But look at all the job creation that could come out of it if we worked with community colleges or the UC system in the right way. I'm lecturing all the time at the UC campuses about all the interest and passion from these students, and many of the professors aren't even looking at their own university's footprint. They're off picking projects and companies that they either hate or they love and sending the students down that pathway rather than looking at the own supply chain of the university. There's all sorts of projects that could be spun up around this work. I just need more friends. like Ross.
Yeah, well, I think you're going to have a bunch of people downloading Persefoni when they go, now when they go home. Now that you've reminded them. Yeah, I think that Mike underplays the fact that Persefoni bats way above its weight because of that intellectual heft that they have on staff. So they may be a small enterprise, but they bat way above their weight. Sarah, one of the things I wanted to, maybe prime you on is, that in our last committee hearing, we spent a lot of time talking about the fact that some of the times cap and trade investments and the state's deployment of resources doesn't always get communicated so well. And so, talk about how you all are thinking about that. The late, I think what was it, last week or the week before, the governor put out a big release about the climate credit and talking about how it's reducing people's energy bills and electricity bills. Talk about what you all are thinking about maybe a little bit on that end.
Sure. Yeah, I think that it really is about telling the story of how the funds that are generated from the cap and trade program are making a difference in the lives of Californians and how they're improving public health, how it's improving air quality, how it's creating jobs, things, and how, of course, it's reducing greenhouse gas emissions and protecting the planet. I think that the way we're thinking about it is just getting that story of the regular drumbeat of information to people. That is press releases, but it's also connecting with constituents directly. It's getting out in the community. It's doing visits as the governor or secretaries from agencies go and do site visits and meet with community members. It's using those opportunities to share about how the California Climate Investments programs are making a difference in their communities. I think that there's been a lot of great work over the years at the Air Resources Board with the different project partners to make sure that even just the branding is consistent and that there is sort of a consistent logo of the California Climate Investments and that is on the websites of projects. It's on, brochures. It's like that. It's that consistent message. And then I want to say, too, I think that there's an opportunity with our coalitions, as I was speaking about earlier, with Pacific Coast Collaborative, with the Climate Alliance, to also amplify the stories of how our policies are making a difference for people. It's not enough to just do the work, although that is, of course, essential. It is also then about communicating that out of why people should care, how it is creating jobs in their communities and improving quality of life. So, I think that many of you know this, but just the top line numbers are incredible in California. The amount of money that's been generated and the amount of projects that have been created is just really astounding because it's really over the past decade that's investing $28 billion in more than 500,000 projects across the state and creating 30,000 jobs. There's a lot of good statistics there, and won't go through all of those. But I think that it's about also finding creative ways of getting to people, and I think it's something that government has struggled with for a long time of how we communicate. In my prior role working for the city of San Francisco, I was in the communications office, and so that's another hat that I wear of how do we make these things that are more technical and complicated more digestible and easy for the public to understand. So that's something I'd like to be able to continue working on over the coming months and years ahead.
So Emily, last word to you. How do we do it better?
Oh, God. I think, what you've heard today is, yes, there's new data, there's lots of requirements, we're seeing benefits from these programs, and I think that's really what we have to keep up. And I think part of the disclosure requirements, why do we need to know about our emissions? There's vulnerability there, and we're trying to mitigate the risk that is inherent in investments, in real estate, because of climate change, and really understanding that. And I think that's something that we've done a very poor job of explaining, is sort of what are the costs that we're experiencing now, and then what are the potential benefits from taking action. It's not just about greenhouse gas emissions, it's about jobs, it's about health, it's about ensuring that there is longevity and support in tax bases, in communities that are really struggling right now. So I do think it's a narrative, and we're in a very different spot than Trump 1.0. I remember right after the election, I was working for the state of California and landed at COP in Marrakesh. And everyone just like was looking to California and was like, please tell us, like, this is, we're in, like, fuck yes, let's go. That was sort of like the attitude. There was like a bravado, and it was all about sort of like, we're here to set targets, we're gonna go for it. And now I think it's a little bit measured. I think there's the landscape has changed, and it's more strategic. And I think there's all this work that is being done with eyes on the prize, and there's a whole bunch of smart people, mostly lawyers, who are tinkering away at trying to figure out how to really shore up what's happening at the subnational level. But there's there's a whole country full of really dedicated people working on these really hard projects. And I think the narrative is really what we need to have to ensure that communities across the country are really experiencing the benefits of these actions. It's not just changing the climate, it's changing the country, and it's for the better, and we need that because of climate change, it does turn out. But yeah, I'm really optimistic, and I think now is a time to think about where there can be bipartisan wins. Not every state is in the Climate Alliance. There's a whole, almost half the nation. The majority of emissions are actually not in Climate Alliance states because they have had sort of the upper hand and they are sort of further ahead when it comes to mitigating climate change. But how do we think about wins in the space that we're in now, focusing on clean energy, on investments, in revenue generation? I think there's a lot of opportunities, and we just can't like take our toys and go home. We have to exist in this world and make sure that we're ready to go and stronger than ever when hopefully things change in the future.
Yeah, the best response is success, right? The best response is prosperity. Questions from the audience? We have about 5-6 minutes left. Let's go to Paula first, and we'll.
Thank you, Ross, and hats off to all of you, really. And Mike, great to see you. So I'm Paula DePern, I'm with the CDP as a special advisor, but I was also very involved in creating and implementing the Chicago Climate Exchange, which was the first cap and trade in the world, all 6 gases. And I hate to point to my gray hair, but I feel like you're all my children. Anyway, but I have 2 very specific, and I mean that sincerely. I know this is a tremendously important field that you're in with all the bids. But I have 2 questions. One for Joel, which ties just into what you both said, which is maybe you could talk a little bit more about how you messaged it and in those counties. That was quite interesting. And then the second question may be a little polemic, especially in view of today's New York Times, but the Superfund approach, which Vermont and New York have taken. I wondered what you might have to say about that.
Yeah, well, let me repeat the questions for anybody listening remotely, and then I'll try and answer number 1. So number 1 is how did we message things in the campaign against Initiative 2117? And then question number 2 was about the sort of climate superfund approach that Vermont and New York are taking. So I'll say, working for the state, I didn't have anything to do with any of the messaging, right? The state officially has no position on ballot initiatives. We follow the law as written. And so, but I am allowed to reflect back now that it's passed. It's not an initiative anymore, and we can have at least a conversation about it. And I'll say the advocates for the No on 2117 campaign, which have been, those are the advocates for keeping the cap and invest program in place, they messaged really strongly around 2 things. One was reducing pollution, and they didn't really differentiate between greenhouse gas emissions and air pollution. I mean, I think everybody in this room knows that those are different things, and they co-occur, but it's not a one-to-one relationship between them, right? It's more complicated than that. But for messaging purposes, it was really effective to talk about reducing pollution and talk about exposure to children and the communities that live near ports who are getting diesel exhaust from trucks and ships all the time, and the agricultural communities that are getting a lot of exhaust, and the communities that now are surrounded by data centers that all sprang up within the last 20 years that are running diesel generators. So that was a really effective component of the messaging. And then the other component was really around what the funds were being invested in. And we at the Department of Ecology do play a role in that piece. So Sarah spoke about many of the important features of communicating what you're doing. And I'll say the branding, super important. We majorly took a page from the California playbook in Washington, and we have a really nice little funded by the CCA logo that shows up on little signs and plaques and websites all over the state. It's really important for people to know where the money is coming from that's supporting these projects. And so so we put out a report every year on how the revenue is being spent, and the advocates took those data and put them into a lot of really nice heat maps and sent postcards to people talking about projects within their legislative districts. And that was really important as well. The yes on 2117 campaign, so the people who are in favor of getting rid of the cap and invest program, I think frankly had a better message. I mean, the message was vote yes to pay less. Now, setting aside the fact that that's not necessarily true, it was a very compelling message. And so I think it was remarkable still that the initiative failed by such a wide margin, in that the no campaign had a much more complicated story to tell, and they were able to tell that story effectively using science and data. So.
Does anyone want to talk about the super polluter? I'm happy to kind of respond a little bit, just because it is active legislation. So the other question that Paula asked was about the super polluter, or the polluters pays proposal in the state of California based on other work in Vermont, New York. And my response is considering that many of the colleagues I work with in the Senate are on the bill, are signed on, have been promoting the bill, is we want to continue to see that type of action, but also we have to remember we do have a polluters pay program. It's called the Cap and Trade Program. We have one in the state of California, so we shouldn't forget that we already have one. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue to look at it. I also think that you see members like Senator Wiener is trying to tie historical pollution to the insurance market. You see that in SB 222, which has certainly started a conversation between climate risk and insurance. And then also, you're going to have a number of folks talking about the interplay of these kind of core polluters, these core facilities, whether you talk about the refineries in California and their historical emissions, but also the fact that we have to come up with a just transition. That it's not necessarily just, let's just keep putting more fees on them, at the same time then getting really, really upset when they make announcements about leaving. And then the jobs impacts and the fact that we increase our imports, or we increase our vulnerability to price spikes around the world. So I think we have to figure out that pathway in the legislature on creating a glide path, a reasonable glide path that allows us to continue to decarbonize at an ambitious scale, but one that realizes that we exist in a global context. And any other thoughts on that? Otherwise, I'm going to go my gentleman right here, give you the last question here.
Hi, John Anderson, Director of Forest Policy for second largest forest landowner here in California. And we have several forest offset projects. And we're kind of concerned about the future of the cap and trade program with the unknowns that we have here. And so it seems like everything we've heard from EPA yesterday, ARB yesterday, was very supportive of the program. And Sarah talks about all these great programs that we're funding, and I'm sure the state doesn't want to end all that. But I think of all of you, maybe Ross, this is directed towards you. What is the temperature in the room, both with the legislature and the administration, on the future cap and trade?
Yeah, well, I know I'm the last thing holding you all before lunch, so I'm going to be very quick, and maybe, John, you and I can have a conversation as we walk out here. Okay. But I will direct you to Senator Stern's quote in Politico yesterday that they saw this morning, and the members of the legislature want to maintain ambition. They understand that this is not cap and trade 1.0 or cap and trade 2.0, that there are lessons we've learned. There are things that we might want to do slightly differently, and we have 120. I have 120 bosses, right? Depending on how you look at it. If I think about the assembly as well, but I do believe that we'll meet the moment. I do believe we'll meet the moment and recognize that, and I'm happy to continue the conversation. But certainly you'll hear more from us. But what the title of the article yesterday was. Boring is good, right? Right? Boring is good. I've got the author right there, so I got boring is good. So I'm going to refer you to that frame of mind of that's how we're trying to kind of promote that in the legislature. Educate, but keep it within the ream of practicality and boringness. I know I had a couple other folks with questions. Maybe you come up and come up and ask us here, because I want to release you all to lunch. But I want you to thank the panelists. Thanks so much for staying, and really appreciate the dialogue.